9 minutes, that's all it took to shatter a nation. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd's voice, gasping, pleading, echoed from a Minneapolis street corner. "I can't breathe." What followed wasn't just a death, it was a detonation. But who was he before that moment? A son, a father, a dreamer from Houston's shadows. This is his story. Every struggle, every hope, every second that changed the world. From the Third Ward to a global cry, one life exposed a fault line, and it starts now. Before he became a symbol, before the world knew his name, George Floyd was just a boy growing up in Houston, Texas. Third Ward, a place that raised him, shaped him, and like so many neighborhoods across America, held both promise and struggle. He was born in 1973, the middle of 5 siblings in a world that already felt stacked against him. His mother, Larcenia Floyd, was his rock, a woman of warmth and resilience, known as Miss Sissy in the community. To young George, she was everything. She worked tirelessly to provide for her children, moving them into a public housing complex called CUNY Homes. It wasn't much, but it was home. Floyd was tall for his age, towering over his classmates. By the time he reached high school, he had grown to 6 feet 6 inches, a gentle giant with a wide, easygoing smile. He had dreams of making it big in football, and for a while it seemed possible. At Jack Yates High School, he played as a tight end and even led his team to the Texas State Championships in 1992, playing inside Houston's iconic Astrodome. That game, that moment, was the kind of memory that sticks with a person. A glimpse of something bigger, a future that felt just within reach. But dreams don't always align with reality. Floyd earned a scholarship to South Florida Community College, but struggled to keep up academically. He later transferred to Texas A&M Kingsville, trying again to carve out a path, but eventually life pulled him in a different direction. He returned home to Third Ward, stepping into a world where opportunities were scarce and expectations were often low. Like many in his community, Floyd faced struggles, economic hardship, mistakes, moments of trying to find his way. He had run-ins with the law, but those who knew him best never defined him by his past. They remembered the man who mentored local kids, who rapped under the name Big Floyd, who was always the first to lend a helping hand. And no matter how far life took him, he never stopped talking about his mother. "She was the only one who could straighten me out," he once said. Then in 2018, she passed away. It crushed him. Friends said he was never quite the same after that. A part of him left with her. By 2020, Floyd had moved to Minneapolis, looking for a fresh start, a new chapter, a way forward. He worked as a security guard, sent money home when he could, and tried to build a better life. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. He never could have known that soon. His name would echo in protests, headlines, and history books. That the world would come to know him, not for the struggles he endured, but for the moment that took everything away. And that moment was coming. Before the world knew his name, George Floyd was just a man trying to navigate life, sometimes succeeding, sometimes struggling. Born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and raised in Houston's Third Ward, he grew up in one of the city's toughest neighborhoods, a place where opportunities were few, but crime, poverty, and systemic obstacles were everywhere. Between 1997 and 2007, Floyd was arrested multiple times on drug and theft charges. The most serious incident was in 2007 when he was involved in a home invasion, reportedly forcing his way into a woman's home with a group of men, holding her at gunpoint while they searched for drugs and money. He pleaded guilty to aggravated robbery in 2009 and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 4 years before being released on parole in 2013. This was a turning point. Those close to him said he was determined to change. He got involved in his church, spoke about guiding young men away from the mistakes he had made, and moved to Minneapolis for a fresh start. He worked as a security guard and took odd jobs to stay afloat. But life wasn't easy. When COVID-19 hit, he lost his job and, according to the medical examiner's report, struggled with substance use again. But Floyd was still trying to move forward, and events that followed would make history. On the evening of May 25th, 2020, George Floyd walked into Cup Foods, a corner store at the intersection of East 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis. He wasn't in a hurry. He laughed with people outside, exchanged a few words with the cashier, and then handed over a $20 bill to pay for a pack of cigarettes. A simple moment, one we've all lived. But that bill, suspected to be counterfeit, set off a chain of events that would end in tragedy. A store employee, following protocol, approached Floyd outside where he sat in his car and asked him to return the cigarettes. Floyd refused. Maybe he didn't understand. Maybe he was frustrated. The employee called 911, saying Floyd seemed awfully drunk and not in control of himself. Minutes later, officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Kuang arrived. They approached Floyd's SUV. Officer Lane drew his weapon, instructing Floyd to show his hands. Floyd, startled, quickly complied. Imagine the fear in that moment. A gun pointed at you, flashing lights, voices shouting. He was pulled from the vehicle and handcuffed, seated on the sidewalk as the officers questioned him. He told them he had been recovering from COVID-19, that he was claustrophobic, that he was afraid, but fear didn't stop what happened next. When the officers tried to place him in the squad car, Floyd panicked. He resisted, not in violence, but in desperation. He pleaded, "Please, don't put me in there. I'm claustrophobic." But his cries didn't matter. Officers Derek Chauvin and Tutau arrived as the struggle continued. And then Floyd was pulled to the pavement, his face pressed against the concrete, hands cuffed behind his back. And then came the knee. Derek Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck, not for a moment, not in passing. He stayed there. As Floyd gasped for breath, as he cried out for his mother, as his voice grew weaker and weaker, Chauvin remained unmoved. The minutes dragged on. "I can't breathe," Floyd repeated again and again.
"I can't breathe. Please, the knee in my neck. I can't breathe shit."
The words echoed through the growing crowd, through the lens of a cell phone camera, through every heart watching. Bystanders begged the officers to stop. They shouted, pleaded, "He's not resisting! Check his pulse!" But nothing changed. At 8:25 p.m., Floyd stopped moving. His voice was gone. His body lay still. Officer Kuang checked for a pulse but found nothing. And still, Chauvin's knee did not lift. It wasn't until paramedics arrived at 8:27 p.m. that the officers finally stepped away. Floyd was loaded onto a stretcher, rushed to Hennepin County Medical Center. But by 9:25 p.m., he was pronounced dead. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. That's how long it took to turn a routine police encounter into a tragedy. That's how long the world watched as a man died under the weight of authority, his final breaths captured on camera, his name becoming a cry for justice. George Floyd wasn't just a name or a hashtag or a headline. He was a man, a father, a son, a friend. He had dreams, flaws, laughter, struggles, just like every one of us. And on that pavement, in those 9 long minutes, he was stripped of all of it. This wasn't just one moment, one officer, one city. It was a reckoning, an undeniable display of a system too many had suffered under for too long. The question is, how many more George Floyds will there be before real change comes? The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, George Floyd's final moments were no longer just a tragedy confined to Minneapolis. They became a rallying cry heard around the world. The image of Derek Chauvin's knee pressing down on Floyd's neck, the desperate pleas for breath, the unbearable silence that followed, it was too much. The world had seen black lives taken unjustly before, but this time, something snapped. By the morning of May 26th, the streets of Minneapolis were no longer quiet. Protesters gathered at the intersection where Floyd had been killed, turning it into an impromptu memorial. Flowers, candles, signs bearing his name, "Justice for George Floyd," covered the pavement. But grief quickly turned into outrage. This wasn't just about one man's death. It was about decades of systemic injustice, about a cycle that kept repeating: Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor. The list was long, and people were done waiting for change. As the sun set, the crowd swelled. Chants filled the air. "Say his name! George Floyd! I can't breathe!" The police presence intensified, but so did the anger. The people demanded one thing: justice. The officers involved needed to be held accountable. But as history had shown, accountability rarely came swiftly, if at all. That night, tensions reached a breaking point. Police fired rubber bullets and tear gas. Protesters shielded themselves with makeshift barricades. A police precinct was set ablaze, flames licking the night sky. The unrest wasn't contained to Minneapolis. It spread across all 50 states. In New York, thousands marched through the streets, shutting down major bridges. In Los Angeles, highways were overtaken by demonstrators. In Washington, D.C., crowds gathered outside the White House, forcing it into lockdown. But this wasn't just an American movement. Across the globe, cities lit up with solidarity. London, Berlin, Paris, Tokyo, people took to the streets chanting George Floyd's name, holding signs that read, "Black Lives Matter" in different languages. Murals of Floyd's face appeared overnight on walls from Kenya to Syria. His name had become a symbol of a much larger fight. Politicians scrambled to respond. Statements of sympathy poured in, but words were no longer enough. The people wanted action. Minneapolis officials soon announced that Chauvin had been fired, but fired wasn't enough. On May 29th, after 3 days of protest, he was finally arrested and charged with third-degree murder and manslaughter. Still, the 3 officers who stood by remained free. The protests intensified. By June, the movement had reached an unstoppable momentum. Calls for police reform surged. City councils across the country were pressured to rethink law enforcement budgets, with activists demanding funding be redirected toward community programs. Corporations, long silent on racial issues, suddenly released statements. The words "defund the police" became a national debate. Even the NFL, which had once blackballed Colin Kaepernick for kneeling in protest, admitted it had been wrong. But amid the fight for change, there was pain. Businesses were burned, communities shaken. Some peaceful protests were met with brutal crackdowns, tear gas, rubber bullets, mass arrests. The media broadcasted images of looted stores, hoping to shift the narrative. But the core message remained. This was about more than property, it was about justice. By the time George Floyd was laid to rest in Houston, the world had changed. Millions had taken to the streets. Millions more had awakened to a reality they could no longer ignore. Laws would be proposed, policies debated, but the question remained, would real change come? Or would this, too, become another tragic story lost to time? One thing was certain, the uprising had sent a message. The people had spoken, and they would not be silenced. The world watched as the trial of Derek Chauvin, the officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck, began on March 29, 2021. It wasn't just a trial about one man's actions. It became a test of America's justice system, a reckoning for police accountability, and a defining moment in the ongoing fight against racial injustice. From the moment jury selection began, the stakes were clear. The prosecution, led by Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, aimed to prove that Chauvin's use of force was excessive, unnecessary, and ultimately criminal. The defense, however, argued that Floyd's death was caused by underlying health conditions and drug use, not the officer's actions. But the world had seen the video. The prosecution's challenge was not convincing people that Floyd had suffered injustice. It was ensuring that the legal system would recognize it too. The prosecution built its case with a relentless series of witnesses, medical experts, law enforcement officials, and everyday people who had been there that day. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Darnella Frazier, the teenage girl who filmed the viral video. Fighting through tears, she described how Floyd begged for his life and how she wished she could have done more. Her words echoed a painful reality, that the bystanders were helpless, trapped in a moment of horror they could never forget. Medical experts countered the defense's claim that Floyd's death was caused by drugs or pre-existing conditions. Dr. Martin Tobin, a pulmonologist, provided a chilling breakdown of how Floyd's airways were slowly crushed under Chauvin's knee. His words left no room for doubt. A healthy person subjected to what Mr. Floyd was subjected to would have died. Even fellow officers took the stand against Chauvin. Minneapolis Police Chief Medaria Arredondo condemned his actions, stating they were not part of our training and went against department policy. This was unprecedented. Law enforcement officers rarely testify against their own, let alone their superiors. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just over 10 hours. On April 20th, 2021, the verdict was read. Guilty on all charges: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Outside the courthouse, crowds erupted in tears and celebration. George Floyd's family embraced, their relief evident. President Joe Biden called it a giant step forward in the march toward justice. But beneath the relief, a sobering truth remained. One guilty verdict couldn't erase centuries of injustice. Chauvin was later sentenced to 22.5 years in prison, a rare conviction for a police officer in America. Many saw it as a landmark decision, proof that accountability was possible. But others questioned whether this was true change or just an isolated moment. Because Floyd's death wasn't just about one officer's actions, it was about a system that allowed it to happen. And the question remained, was this a turning point or just another moment in a cycle that keeps repeating? George Floyd's murder was more than a tragic loss of life. It was a catalyst that sent shockwaves across the globe. But nearly 4 years later, where does that fight stand? What has changed, and what remains painfully the same? The immediate impact was undeniable. Within days of Floyd's death, streets across America and the world filled with millions demanding justice. It was the largest civil rights movement in decades, with protests in all 50 U.S. states and over 60 countries. Defund the police became a rallying cry. Cities vowed to reform their departments, and Floyd's name became a symbol of racial injustice. The pressure led to historic moments. Officers charged, laws reconsidered, and conversations about policing finally forced into the mainstream. But change, especially systemic change, is never simple. Some cities made moves. Minneapolis disbanded its police department's tactical unit and cut its police budget, redirecting funds to mental health and violence prevention programs. Other places followed suit, implementing bans on chokeholds, stricter rules on body cameras, and new oversight boards. Congress even introduced the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which aimed to end qualified immunity for officers, ban racial profiling, and create a national database for police misconduct. But that bill, it failed in the Senate, and the deeper structural issues, they remain. The numbers tell a harsh truth. In the year after Floyd's death, police in the U.S. killed over 1,000 people, almost identical to the years before. Even after all the protests, all the outrage, the daily reality didn't change overnight. Black Americans are still disproportionately killed by police. Investigations into misconduct are still rare. Accountability is still an uphill battle. And what about the cultural shift? Companies, sports teams, and politicians promised change. Streets were painted with Floyd's name. Social media flooded with solidarity posts. But how much of it was real and how much was performative? The term racial reckoning was thrown around. Yet years later, diversity programs are being cut, and the momentum that once seemed unstoppable has slowed. For every victory, there was pushback. Laws restricting protest rights were passed in multiple states. Some cities, instead of defunding, increased police budgets to their highest levels yet. The narrative shifted, with some claiming the movement went too far, using rising crime rates to justify old tactics. This fight was never about one man, one trial, or one moment. The final lesson of George Floyd's story is that the fight is ongoing. Change isn't a single protest or a bill passed in Congress. It's a constant, grueling battle against a system designed to resist reform It's people refusing to forget, continuing to push, and holding leaders accountable. The world shook when George Floyd died. The question now is, will it shake again before anything truly changes? If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because silence is complicity. And if you're ready to go deeper, explore the stories that shook the system. Do check our other videos also. Stay aware, stay loud, stay human.